You ever have one of those mornings where you just know nothing is going to go right, but you can't even imagine how wrong it's about to get? That was me when I first noticed the cracks in the wall I had spent months building out back. And not just any wall. I'm talking about a wall that I poured my sweat, my savings, and more stubbornness than any human should ever have into. I had moved to Riverside Heights for peace, for space, for a little corner of the world where I could breathe without the city's chaos hanging over me. And I thought I had it figured out. I thought I had everything under control. And then along came the Willow Creek HOA, and they laughed. I swear, they laughed right at my wall. I mean it. The kind of laugh that makes you feel small and ridiculous, like the entire neighborhood is in on the joke and somehow you missed the memo. I can still see Karen from the HOA committee smirking as she leaned on the clipboard, TISC-NG at the angles of my carefully constructed stone barrier, like it was a preschool art project. Eli, you know that doesn't meet our community guidelines, she said, shaking her head like she had just spotted a tragic fashion crime. And I wanted to scream, I really did, because I had built that wall to hold back the river in the spring floods, not to impress a committee obsessed with straight lines and paint colors. But I nodded, smiled through my teeth, and let her go on, because I knew arguing would only make them enjoy it more. And, honestly, I didn't have the fight in me that day. Weeks went by. The wall held. The river rose a little, then receded, and I started to feel like maybe, just maybe, I was smarter than the HOA. Maybe my stubbornness had a point after all. I would stand out there in the evenings, beer in hand, watching the water lap at the edges of my property, and think about how funny it was that the people who were supposed to maintain order in the neighborhood didn't have a clue about the one real danger lurking in plain sight. I even started calling my wall Karen-proof, half joking, half serious, because every time I imagined her reaction if it failed, I could practically hear her gasp of outrage. But as comfortable as I started feeling, there was always this undercurrent of tension, like the universe was whispering that my little victory was temporary and that chaos was lurking right behind the next bend of the river. And then it happened. It started with the rain, not a storm, nothing dramatic at first, just that steady, relentless kind that turns your yard into a swamp and makes you question why anyone ever thought rivers were charming. I remember waking up to the sound of water running, something heavier than usual, and walking out to find my driveway slick, the edge of my lawn turning into a mini creek. My heart sank when I saw the river, usually a friendly ribbon of water I'd waved at from my porch, swelling, darker, angrier, like it had finally noticed me. And the wall, my Karen-proof wall, was bowing in the middle, little cracks spiderwebbing across the stones, and I knew immediately that my months of work, my late nights, my careful planning, were hanging by a thread. And before I could even start thinking of solutions, my phone buzzed, another message from the HOA. I hesitated, then opened it, because I was weak and, well, human. Eli, we've noticed some changes to your property. The wall is not compliant and must be adjusted immediately. Please respond. 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 The river was doing its best to turn my backyard into the next Amazon, and they were asking me to fill out paperwork? I could feel my blood pressure spike, and I stared at the message, the water, the bending stones, and I laughed. Not the polite laugh I'd give at a dinner party, not the, oh, isn't that cute, laugh, but the kind that shakes your chest and tastes a little bitter because it's part disbelief, part fury, part something you can't even name. The HOA was worried about lines and paint colors while the river was planning a full-on demolition. I wanted to throw my phone in the river and walk away, let the water take what it wanted, but then there was a voice behind me. My neighbor, old Mr. Jensen, who had seen more floods than he could count, leaning on his cane with that half-smile of someone who knows misery when he sees it. You didn't think they'd care about rivers, did you? He said, shaking his head. And somehow, he made me feel both stupid and understood all at once. That night, I stayed up watching the rain, watching the water creep closer, listening to it whisper promises of destruction, and thinking about Karen, about Willow Creek HOA, about all the little rules that seemed so important when the world made sense, and so meaningless when the world tried to eat your house. I imagined her walking down my street, clipboard in hand, seeing my backyard underwater, and I laughed again because if irony had a taste, this was it. And I couldn't sleep. Not because I was scared, not entirely, but because my mind wouldn't stop running through every scenario, every possible outcome, and trying to figure out how I had let things get this far without losing my mind completely. The river wasn't just a river anymore. It was a test, a reckoning, and my wall, which had been my pride, my little shield, was turning into a metaphor for stubbornness and futility all at once. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the river had not. I stepped outside and realized something that hit me harder than any HOA scolding ever could. This wasn't going to be a small fix. The middle section of the wall had collapsed, stones scattered, mud and debris taking the shape of what used to be my careful plan, and the water was moving with a quiet sort of menace that made it clear it wasn't done. I wandered along the edge, inspecting the damage, and felt that peculiar mix of grief and awe that only comes when you're staring at the raw power of something bigger than yourself. And I knew then, deep down, that this was going to be a long fight, not with the HOA, not with neighbors, but with nature itself, and that every laugh I had endured before suddenly felt small in comparison. I was tired, frustrated, but not beaten, because if there was one thing I had learned building that wall, it was that stubbornness can't solve everything, but it can at least make you stand and watch the storm face to face. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I kept pacing the edge of what used to be my backyard, kicking at stones, feeling the mud squish between my boots, and just trying to make sense of it all. The river had taken something I wasn't even sure I could measure, $2.4 million worth. Though that number didn't even capture the hours, the sweat, the plans, the memories tied up in this house and this wall. It wasn't just money, it was pride. It was the life I had built slowly and carefully in Riverside Heights. And I kept thinking, over and over, about Karen and the Willow Creek HOA, about their smug little meetings, their clipboards, their obsession with rules over reality. I could almost hear her voice dripping with judgment. Eli, this doesn't meet the standards. Standards couldn't stop a river. I remember dialing the HOA office the next morning, my hands shaking, because part of me still hoped, maybe stupidly, that they'd suddenly see sense, that someone would hear the desperation in my voice and say, Eli, forget the guidelines, just survive. But of course, that didn't happen. Instead, the woman who answered, a sharp voice named Linda, practically chirped, "We've noted the damage, Eli. Please remember to submit your wall adjustment plan. Compliance is mandatory." And I swear I froze mid-breath. I mean, she actually said that, like I had time to fill out paperwork while my backyard was turning into a river delta. I hung up, dropped my phone in the mud, and stared at the water like it had personally betrayed me. The absurdity of it all almost made me laugh, except the kind of laugh that comes out in jagged, strangled bursts, like the world is both a joke and a threat at the same time. By late morning, neighbors started to gather, curious, gawking, some with sympathy, most with that casual, almost gloating curiosity people have when bad things happen next door. Old Mr. Jensen ambled over, his cane sticking into the soft mud, squinting at the destruction. "Well, Eli," he said, scratching his beard, "guess that wall wasn't quite the fortress you thought it was." And I wanted to argue, to yell, to tell him he didn't understand, but instead I just shook my head, mud squishing underfoot, because he was right. That wall had been my fortress in theory, but nature doesn't follow theory. Nature doesn't negotiate with HOA rules or your sense of propriety. Nature just is. Then came the calls from my insurance company. I could almost hear the sigh in the receptionist's voice through the phone, the way she carefully wove her words so they sounded sympathetic while making it crystal clear that most of this loss was, frankly, not covered. Flood insurance only goes so far, and apparently, acts of nature combined with structural choices is a loophole big enough to drive a truck through. I wanted to throw the phone, but instead I just sat there, staring at the ceiling, imagining every brick I had laid, every stone I had carefully positioned, sliding into the river, gone forever, and with it, that feeling of control I had thought I had. And then, as if to punish me further, my phone buzzed again. Another HOA email. I opened it with a trembling hand. "We've received reports of water damage. Compliance must still be met immediately. Please submit photos." Photos. They wanted photos while the river was still swallowing my yard. I slammed the phone down, and for a moment, I just let myself scream, loud and empty, letting the frustration echo through the half-collapsed walls of my property. Somewhere in the chaos, I realized I had to act. Sitting and staring wasn't going to fix a river. I grabbed my boots, some sandbags, and a shovel, and I went outside to try and do what I could. It felt pointless, laughably so, but I kept telling myself that trying was better than doing nothing. As I worked, I could hear the neighbors whispering, some muttering about how foolish I had been to build the wall in the first place, how I should have just followed the HOA rules, how I was asking for trouble. And that hurt worse than the water. Not because I cared what they thought, but because it felt like the whole community, the people who were supposed to share space with me, were judging me while a river literally ate my backyard. It was maddening. The days that followed were a blur of rain, mud, exhaustion, and confrontation. I spent hours reinforcing what was left of the wall, dragging sandbags, patching cracks, and watching the water inch closer with an almost sadistic patience. And then came the official HOA visit. Karen and a few others drove up in their pristine SUVs, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning, nodding at each other as if the apocalypse hadn't already arrived in my backyard. "Eli," Karen said sweetly, like a serpent, "we understand your wall has suffered some damage. However, we still need you to comply with the community guidelines." I stopped mid-shovel swing, mud dripping off my hands, heart pounding. Comply? Comply with what? The river is taking my house. Karen, do you even see this? She tilted her head, lips pursed in that calculated way HOA people do when they want to seem reasonable, but are really just enjoying their control, and said, "Eli, guidelines are in place to maintain property values and community aesthetics. We trust you'll handle it responsibly." Handle it responsibly? I almost dropped the shovel on her head right then. Instead, I just laughed, that same bitter, exhausted laugh that makes strangers wonder if you're losing your mind, and went back to work. It was during one of those moments, shoveling against the creeping water, that I realized something. This wasn't just about the wall. It wasn't about money, or HOA rules, or even pride. This was about control, about who gets to decide what matters, and whose judgment counts when the world is falling apart. The river didn't care about Willow Creek HOA. The river didn't care about Karen's perfect spreadsheets. The river just moved, unstoppable, indifferent, and I suddenly understood that if I wanted to survive this, I had to stop thinking about rules and start thinking about resilience. I had to fight smart, not polite. And that meant looking beyond the mud, beyond the stones, beyond the judgment, and figuring out how to reclaim what I could before it was all gone. So I started making plans, small ones at first, ridiculous ones, almost laughable, like stacking furniture to divert water, digging channels, making makeshift levees, anything to keep the flood at bay. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it started to work. Not perfectly, not safely, but enough to slow the worst of it. That was when I realized something else. HOA wasn't my enemy, not really. They were a symbol, a reminder that people often care more about appearances than reality. And if I let their laughter, their rules, their smug little comments dictate my actions, I would lose before I even tried. So I ignored them. Completely. I stopped responding to emails, stopped worrying about compliance, stopped imagining Karen shaking her head at me. The river demanded my full attention, and that was all that mattered. By the time the floodwaters finally began to recede, the damage was catastrophic. $2.4 million worth of property gone. Trees uprooted, lawn washed away, foundation weakened, and the wall? Half of it still standing, crooked, defiant in a way that somehow made me proud. And as I surveyed the scene, mud caking my boots, water dripping from my hair, I realized I had survived, and maybe even learned something. Nature was bigger than all of us, including Karen, including the HOA, including rules and regulations. But so was stubbornness. So was persistence. And so, against all odds, I stood there and laughed, not bitterly this time, but with a little spark of triumph, because I had faced the storm, faced the river, faced the ridiculousness of the world and refused to let it break me completely. And yet, as I looked around at the devastation, there was still that nagging, unsettled feeling, that knowledge that the community, the HOA, even the river, hadn't finished with me. There were reports to file, repairs to plan, explanations to give, and the haunting thought that maybe, just maybe, the next storm would come faster, hit harder, and laugh louder. But for that moment, mud-streaked and exhausted, I felt alive in a way that rules and judgments had never made me feel. I had faced the absurdity, the power, the chaos, and survived. The morning after the floodwaters finally receded, I stepped outside and felt like I was walking on the edge of some surreal painting. Everything was familiar, yet completely unrecognizable. The yard, the riverbank, the crooked wall I had built with my own hands, still leaning stubbornly, as if daring the world to knock it down again. The air smelled like mud, wet wood, and crushed leaves, heavy and almost sweet in a way that made my chest ache. I could see Mr. Jensen across the street, waving, but I wasn't in the mood for conversation. I just wanted to walk, to touch the stones, to measure the damage with my own eyes, because numbers on a paper couldn't convey what I had actually lost, couldn't tell you the way the water had taken months of my life and spat it into the river like it was nothing. Then Karen arrived, of course. She showed up exactly like you'd imagine an HOA inspector would: polished shoes, perfectly ironed blouse, clipboard in hand, scanning the wreckage with that look of detached authority. "Eli," she said, and I swear her tone was almost sweet, like she was delivering a compliment. "We see that the wall suffered quite a bit of damage. But please, remember, compliance is still required." I paused, mid-step, mud squishing under my boots, and just stared at her. For a long moment, nothing came out. Then I laughed. Not bitterly, not weakly, but loud, shaking laughter that carried across the yard. "Compliance," I said, letting the word hang between us. "You want me to worry about compliance when $2.4 million just went down the river?" Her smile faltered, ever so slightly, like a hint of surprise breaking through the veneer of control. And I realized, right then, that no clipboard, no meeting, no rule, no HOA meeting could touch what I had just survived. I didn't argue anymore. I didn't explain myself. I just worked. I started salvaging what I could: stones from the wall, pieces of furniture, anything that the river hadn't claimed yet. It was exhausting, humbling, and strangely empowering all at once. Every brick I lifted, every sandbag I repositioned felt like a small victory, a tiny reclaiming of control. And as I worked, I noticed something I hadn't before. Other neighbors were starting to help, quietly, cautiously, almost sheepishly, as if my stubborn persistence had given them permission to acknowledge the disaster without fear of HOA judgment. There was a strange, silent camaraderie in that shared work, and for the first time, I realized that maybe the river hadn't just destroyed property. It had shifted the dynamics of this little community, had exposed who cared about appearances and who actually cared about people. Weeks passed. I rebuilt the wall, not perfectly, not according to any HOA standard, but solidly enough that I felt safe again. I reinforced the banks of the river, added drainage channels, and learned things about resilience I never thought I would need to know. Karen and the HOA didn't disappear. They still sent emails, still showed up for inspections, but by then, I had stopped giving a damn. Their rules had no weight here, not when I had faced a force far greater than their clipboards and guidelines. I found a strange satisfaction in ignoring them, in letting the river and the mud and my own effort define what mattered. It was a quiet rebellion, but it felt righteous. And yet, the experience changed me. I started noticing the little hypocrisies, the tiny absurdities that HOA rules created. How someone could get fined for paint colors while the river destroyed real property. How people cared more about appearances than reality. It made me question everything about control, authority, and community. I wasn't angry anymore. I was thoughtful, wary, and somehow stronger, like I had been tempered by water, mud, and bureaucracy alike. I'd faced something bigger than myself and come out alive, and I knew that no matter what Karen or Willow Creek HOA said, that knowledge belonged to me alone. But the river left scars that were more than just physical. My finances were shattered, my pride bruised, and there were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how fragile everything really is. $2.4 million gone in a flash. That number haunted me, but it also reminded me that money, rules, and appearances are transient, while persistence, stubbornness, and courage, those are real. Those are the things you can carry through storms, literal or figurative. And then came the moment that cemented the story for the neighborhood. It was a late afternoon, golden sunlight reflecting off the wet mud, when Karen and a few board members drove up to check on the progress again. I was standing on what was left of the wall, shovel in hand, mud up to my knees, and I could see the exact expression on her face. The combination of disbelief, frustration, and maybe, just maybe, grudging respect. Eli, she said, trying to reclaim authority, we still need a compliance plan for your property. I smiled, a little crooked, a little muddy, and said, Karen, the river's already decided what it thinks about compliance. I suggest you take a walk and see it for yourself. She didn't know how to respond. I could almost see her mentally rewriting her speech, her authority slipping away with every inch of mud and water we had reclaimed. And I laughed, not at her, not cruelly, but with the satisfaction of someone who had faced the absurdity and survived intact. The rest of the neighborhood started talking. Some supported me, some criticized, and some just watched, like spectators to a slow-motion train wreck. And that was fine. The point wasn't to win everyone over. The point was to survive, to endure, to rebuild on my own terms. The crooked wall stood as a testament to that stubbornness, to the reality that you can't always follow rules and come out unscathed, but you can follow your own judgment and still stand. It was imperfect, messy, and entirely mine. But here's the kicker. I still get emails. Karen still sends updates. The HOA still pretends they have power over my property, and sometimes I can't help but chuckle at the absurdity. The wall stands crooked, defiant, and a little comical in its imperfection, like a middle finger made of stone to every guideline and rule they ever tried to impose. And the river? Well, it calms down eventually, but I know it's always there, waiting, ready to remind me that nature has the final say. It's a humbling thought, but also strangely comforting. So now, when people ask me why I didn't just tear the wall down, why I didn't obey the HOA, why I chose to fight the river instead of filing complaints or surrendering, I tell them this. Sometimes rules are meaningless, sometimes authority is blind, and sometimes surviving is about stubbornness, creativity, and a refusal to be intimidated. The river and the HOA taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. And yes, it cost me $2.4 million, but it gave me something else, something you can't quantify in dollars, something you carry with you when the world tries to dictate how you live your life. And that's why, if you ever wonder whether to follow the rules, whether to bow to authority, whether to let someone else define what matters in your life, think about my wall, think about the river, think about Karen's clipboard and her laughter. Sometimes, the only choice is to stand your ground, embrace the mess, and keep going, even if the world thinks you're foolish. Because the alternative, giving up, is far worse. So what do you think? Was I reckless, or was I brave? Did the HOA have a point, or were they just ridiculous? And what would you do if the river showed up at your doorstep and the people in charge cared more about rules than reality? I want to hear your thoughts, your takes, your outrage, your support. Drop it all in the comments, because this isn't just my story anymore. It's a conversation about control, community, and the absurdity of human life when nature shows up uninvited. And maybe, just maybe, your comment will remind someone else that standing your ground, even when the world laughs at you, is sometimes the most important thing you can do.